Walter Grady stood in the quiet of his front yard, staring at the letter that had arrived that morning. His hands, weathered from years of hard work and wear, trembled slightly as he unfolded the thick envelope. It was official. His worst fears had come true. The Homeowners Association, led by Nancy Whitmore, the woman who had been trying to control every aspect of his life for months, had slapped him with a $50,000 fine. His eyes scanned the letter, each word cutting deeper than the last. Violation of neighborhood standards, it said. His crime? He hadn't painted the fence. The same fence that had been standing for over 50 years, originally built by his father. And to top it off, the HOA threatened to foreclose on his property if the fine wasn't paid in full within 30 days. Walter's fists clenched. He had known it was coming. The letters had started months ago. Petty complaints about his outdated fence, his unkept lawn, and his unsightly old barn. He had ignored them all, but now this was different. $50,000. That was no small amount for a man on a fixed income, living alone after his wife passed 2 years ago. But this wasn't just about the money. It was about the sheer audacity of Nancy Whitmore and the HOA. They had been poking and prodding at him, testing how far they could push before he broke. They thought they could control him. They thought he was just an old man, a relic of the past who didn't know how to fight back. But Walter had something they didn't expect. He had power, and he had knowledge. Knowledge of a piece of land that they had never bothered to investigate. You see, Walter wasn't just a retired engineer. He was the owner of the only road that led into Woodland Pines. The HOA had spent years developing the area, but they never bothered to ask who owned the access road. They assumed it was just part of the community, a public road, easily ignored. But that wasn't the case. Walter's father had made sure to keep the deed for the road when they sold the rest of the land in the 1970s. The road was his, privately owned, but open for public use. And Walter, for the longest time, had let the HOA and the residents of Woodland Pines think it was just a public road, part of the community's infrastructure. That was the mistake the HOA made. They had no idea who they were messing with. Walter Grady owned the key to the whole neighborhood. And now, as he stood in front of his old home, the sun setting in the distance, he knew that it was time to take action. The HOA had pushed too far. They had underestimated him. And now he was going to make them regret it. He crumpled the letter in his hands and tossed it into the trash bin. There would be no payment, no compliance. He wasn't going to sit back and let Nancy Whitmore and her cronies ruin his life any longer. Walter took a deep breath and walked to the shed in the backyard, where his tools rested, ready for the task ahead. It was time to remind the HOA just who controlled Woodland Pines. They wouldn't get away with this. Not this time. Walter Grady lived a quiet, simple life in the small wooden house he inherited from his father. After his wife passed away 2 years ago, everything had slowed down. The house, the yard, the barn, they all reminded him of the peaceful life he had lived and the land that had been passed down for generations. He was content in his solitude, tending to the farm and enjoying his late years. But this peace would not last, not with the HOA pressing down on him. It started innocently enough with a letter from the HOA. They demanded that Walter repaint his fence. The paint had begun to fade, they said, and it didn't meet the community's aesthetic standards. Walter chuckled when he read the letter. Who do they think they are, he thought, tossing it aside. But when the next few letters came, they were more than just requests. They were demands, and then fines. The fines started small, just a few $100s here and there for not trimming the grown or for not having a perfectly manicured lawn. But as the weeks passed, the fines grew larger. Another $500 for not replacing the mailbox to match the HOA's preferred style. A $1,000 penalty for not removing a tree branch that hung slightly over the sidewalk. The fines weren't about what was fair, they were about control. The HOA wasn't just trying to make the neighborhood pretty, they were trying to dictate how everyone lived, down to the smallest detail. Walter had ignored it all. He didn't want to make a fuss. He wasn't one for confrontation. And besides, he never asked for any of these rules. But this latest letter was different. This was no small fine. This was a $50,000 fine for not complying with their standards because his fence wasn't up to their aesthetic guidelines. The letter threatened to foreclose on his property if he didn't pay. Walter was seething. They think I'm just some old man they can push around. They have no idea who they're dealing with, he muttered under his breath. He had enough of their petty rules, their intimidation. But this time, it wasn't just about the money. This time, it was personal. He knew they had crossed a line. It wasn't just about a fence. The HOA had been testing his limits, seeing just how far they could push before he cracked. But what they didn't know was that Walter had something they couldn't control. They had no idea what they had just done. Walter stood in his front yard, looking out at the world as he held the letter in his hands. He could feel his heart racing with anger, but something else was bubbling inside him. Power. He had power that the HOA didn't know about, a secret that no one in the neighborhood understood. Walter wasn't just a retired engineer. He wasn't just the man with a small, unkempt house on the outskirts of the neighborhood. Walter Grady was the owner of the only road into Woodland Pines. Since the 1970s, when his father had sold most of the land to the developers who built the neighborhood, Walter had kept one thing: ownership of the access road. The road was the only way in and out of Woodland Pines. It stretched for over 1.2 miles, connecting the neighborhood to the outside world. Everyone used it, but no one ever thought to ask who owned it. Walter's father had made sure to keep the deed for the road when he sold the rest of the land. The developers were eager to build, but they never bothered to inquire about the access road. And Walter, for all these years, had never said a word. He let them use the road, never asking for anything in return. He didn't want to cause trouble. But now that the HOA had crossed the line, it was time to let them know exactly who held the keys to the neighborhood. It wasn't just about the fine anymore. It wasn't just about the control they wanted over his house or his land. It was about something bigger: respect. The HOA thought they could bully him, but Walter wasn't the type to back down, not when it came to something so important. He would make sure they understood one thing: they needed him. He spent the next few days quietly gathering his documents. The deed to the road, his father's original land agreement from 1974, the maps, the legal paperwork, all of it. Walter had never really needed it before, but now he had a purpose for it. He knew that the HOA would try to fight him, and he would need all the ammunition he could get. He also contacted an old friend, David, a lawyer who had once been a student of his when he worked as an engineer. David had gone on to become a respected attorney in the area, specializing in property and land law. Walter knew David well enough to trust him with the truth about the road. When they met, David was shocked. "Wait, you mean to tell me the entire neighborhood has been using this road for decades, and they never even asked who owned it?" Walter nodded. "Yep. They've been living here thinking it's a public road, but it's not. It never was. It's mine. And now they're trying to take me to court over a fence. They don't know what they're messing with." David raised an eyebrow, a grin slowly spreading across his face. "Well, Walter, this is going to get interesting. Let's make sure they understand exactly who's in charge here." As David worked on compiling the legal documents, Walter began to prepare himself for what was to come. He didn't want to start a war with the HOA. He didn't want to get into a legal battle, but at the same time he knew he couldn't let them continue their bullying. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about setting a precedent, about showing the people in the neighborhood that they didn't have to live under the thumb of the HOA. Over the next few weeks, the tension in Woodland Pines escalated. Nancy Whitmore, the HOA president, grew more and more aggressive in her attempts to force Walter to comply. She sent letters, made phone calls, even enlisted the local authorities to help her pressure Walter into obeying. But it was all for nothing. Every attempt she made to push Walter into a corner only pushed him further into action. The more she tried to control him, the more determined he became to fight back. The HOA, though powerful, had no idea that the real power was in Walter's hands, and he was about to make sure they knew it. The tension in Woodland Pines had been building for weeks. Every day, Walter Grady felt the weight of the HOA's oppressive grip on his property. Nancy Whitmore, the ever-ambitious president of the HOA, wasn't about to let a little thing like the law stop her. She was determined to force Walter into submission. And the more she pushed, the more Walter's resolve hardened. One afternoon, while Walter was in his garden, a black SUV pulled up to the driveway. Two men in uniform stepped out, HOA enforcement officers, a pair of hired muscle that Nancy had brought in to intimidate him. They were not there to discuss legalities, but to make sure Walter understood that they weren't going to back down. One of the officers, a bulky man with tattoos creeping up his neck, walked up to Walter with a smug smile. "Mr. Grady," the officer said with a tone that dripped with false politeness. "We're here to inspect your property. The HOA has made it clear that you failed to meet our standards." Walter's grip tightened on the shovel in his hand, but he said nothing. He had already heard the threats. He knew exactly what was going on. The HOA wasn't just upset about his fence anymore. They were using every trick in the book to try and push him out. Walter, however, had lived through tough situations before. This wasn't going to intimidate him. "I'm not interested in your inspection," Walter said coolly, his voice steady. "You don't have permission to be here." The officer's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "You'll regret this, old man," he muttered before turning away. "Don't say we didn't warn you." He and his partner walked back to the SUV, leaving Walter standing there in his yard, resolute but seething with anger. But this was just the beginning. Over the next few days, the HOA ramped up their attacks. Nancy Whitmore wasn't just content with sending threatening letters anymore. She wanted to make Walter's life miserable. First, they sent a crew to tear down the old wooden fence Walter's father had built decades ago. Without any permission, they bulldozed a small section, claiming it was a safety hazard. The workers left behind a mess of splintered wood, broken posts, and scattered debris. When Walter found out, he was livid. He immediately contacted his lawyer, David, and together they prepared to take legal action. But the damage was done. The HOA had struck first, and it was clear they weren't going to back down until Walter was completely broken. Next came a more personal attack. Late one night, Walter's beloved dog, Daisy, went missing. Daisy was an old golden retriever, loyal and friendly, and Walter had raised her since she was a puppy. He searched the property for hours, calling her name, growing more frantic with each passing minute. By morning, there was still no sign of her. The next day, a neighbor called. "Walter, I think you should come over here," the voice on the phone said, tight with concern. "I saw a van pull up late last night. I didn't think anything of it, but this morning I found Daisy locked up in the back of the van. She's fine, but she's not the only one." When Walter arrived at his neighbor's house, he was horrified to see that several of his other neighbors' pets were also locked up in the van: dogs, cats, even a few rabbits. All of them had been taken in the dead of night without any explanation or permission. Walter's heart raced with anger. He was beginning to realize that the HOA's tactics were becoming personal, and they were willing to go to any length to make his life hell. This wasn't about property or aesthetics anymore. It was about control. Walter immediately contacted the local authorities, but the police couldn't find any evidence of wrongdoing. The HOA had covered their tracks well, but Walter knew who was behind it, and he wasn't about to let them get away with it. Then the ultimate move came. One afternoon, while Walter was sitting on his porch, a utility truck rolled up to his house. The truck was emblazoned with the HOA's logo, and the crew began unloading equipment. Walter's eyes narrowed. They were there to shut off his power. Walter stormed outside to confront them. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded. "We've been instructed to turn off your electricity and water, Mr. Grady," the lead worker said, without so much as a hint of remorse. "Until you comply with the HOA's demands. This is the first step." Walter felt his blood boil. This was a step too far. They were trying to take away his basic utilities, his water, his electricity, just because he refused to play by their rules. Walter's hands shook, but he knew he couldn't back down. He turned away from the workers and walked to his shed where he kept his tools. With a deep breath, he grabbed the heavy wrench he had used for years. There was no way he was going to let them turn off his power without a fight. "I'll take care of this myself," he muttered under his breath, walking toward the meter box. With a few swift motions, Walter had the main power switch turned off, but he didn't stop there. He then cut off the water supply to the house, securing the pipes with a combination of tools he had used for decades. Standing outside, looking at the crew with defiance in his eyes, Walter knew this would escalate quickly. But he was ready. He had nothing to lose anymore. The HOA had pushed him to the brink, and now he was going to fight back. The neighborhood began to split as more people started to take sides. Some residents saw what was happening and began to support Walter. They had their own frustrations with the HOA's overreach. Others, however, continued to side with Nancy Whitmore, either out of fear or loyalty to the idea of maintaining the community's perfect image. But the rift was clear. This wasn't just about Walter anymore. It was about the entire neighborhood. Nancy, growing desperate, called an emergency HOA meeting. Walter knew what that meant. They were planning to retaliate. The whole neighborhood would be there, and Nancy would use this as an opportunity to solidify her control. But Walter wasn't going to let that happen. He had a plan of his own. This time, he was going to expose them for who they really were. He spent the next few days gathering his documents, organizing the legal papers, and preparing for the showdown that was coming. When the day of the meeting arrived, Walter was ready. He wasn't going to sit back and let the HOA bulldoze him any longer. He was going to stand up for himself, for the community, and for everything his father had built. The day of the HOA meeting had finally arrived. The tensions in Woodland Pines were thick, like a storm about to break. Walter could feel it in the air. Nancy Whitmore had called an emergency session, and every resident of the neighborhood had been summoned to attend. Walter knew this was going to be the moment of truth, the showdown between the HOA and him, the one man they had underestimated. Walter wasn't just going to show up. He wasn't going to stand there and take their threats or their intimidation. He had something up his sleeve, something that would reveal the HOA for what they truly were and force them to back down once and for all. The meeting was held in the community center, a small building that had once been the heart of Woodland Pines. But now it was little more than a place where Nancy and the other HOA members gathered to discuss rules and fines. Walter arrived early, as was his custom. He didn't want to draw attention to himself. He quietly made his way to the back of the room, sitting down in a corner where he could watch without being seen. He could already see Nancy at the front of the room, standing confidently with a smile on her face. She was in her element. She was the one with the power, the one who controlled the narrative in Woodland Pines. But what she didn't know was that today, the narrative was about to change. As the meeting began, Nancy quickly addressed the crowd, her voice ringing out with authority. Ladies and gentlemen of Woodland Pines, thank you for joining us on such short notice. As you all know, there's been an issue with one of our residents, Mr. Walter Grady. He has repeatedly refused to comply with the community's rules, and now he has crossed the line by failing to pay his fines. We are here today to discuss the next steps. Walter could see the crowd's reactions, some of them nodding in agreement with Nancy, while others exchanged uncomfortable glances. He knew Nancy had built her power by dividing the community, making people believe they had to choose sides. She was trying to paint him as the villain, but Walter wasn't about to let that happen. He stood up, his movements slow and deliberate, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. The murmurs of conversation died down as all eyes turned to him. Nancy's smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "Walter," she began, her voice sharp, "I'm sure you know why we're here. You've been given ample opportunity to comply with the HOA's rules, and yet you continue to defy them. I'm afraid we'll have no choice but to take legal action if you don't pay the fine immediately." Walter didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped forward, calmly and deliberately. He looked out at the crowd, letting the silence hang in the air for a moment before speaking. "You think you know who I am," Walter said, his voice steady. "You think you've got me cornered, but you've made a mistake." Nancy raised an eyebrow. "What are you talking about?" Walter reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a stack of legal papers, slamming them down onto the table in front of him. "I don't need to pay your fines," he said, his voice growing stronger with every word, "because I'm the one who owns this entire neighborhood's access road." The room went completely silent. Nancy's eyes widened in shock. "What? What are you talking about?" Walter didn't back down. He laid out the documents one by one, showing the original deeds and land agreements that proved he was the sole owner of the road that led into Woodland Pines. He could feel the energy in the room shift as the crowd began to murmur in disbelief. Some looked confused, others looked angry. But they all knew one thing now: the HOA had been lying to them all along. Walter turned to the crowd, holding up one of the documents. "This is the deed to the road that leads into Woodland Pines. It was passed down to me by my father, who ensured that I would always have control over the road, even when he sold the land to the developers. The HOA has no claim to it, and you all have been using it under the false assumption that it's a public road." The silence in the room was deafening. Nancy's face had drained of color, and for the first time she looked uncertain. This can't be true," she stammered. "There must be some mistake." "No mistake," Walter replied, his voice cutting through the tension. "And I'm done being bullied by you, Nancy. I've spent enough years letting you and your little HOA gang push people around. You've tried to control this entire community, But now you're going to learn what happens when you mess with the wrong person. Walter reached into his bag and pulled out a printed map of Woodland Pines, showing the layout of the neighborhood and highlighting the road in question. You all use this road to get in and out of here, he said, pointing to the map. But without my permission, you have no access to it. And that means no more fines, no more demands, and no more authority over my property. The crowd began to stir, whispers of disbelief spreading like wildfire. Nancy stood frozen, her hands shaking slightly as she tried to comprehend what was happening. The truth had been revealed, and there was no denying it. She had been playing a dangerous game, and now it was clear that she had lost. Walter continued, his voice gaining strength. I've already contacted my lawyer, and we've filed an injunction against the HOA's actions. You won't be able to make a single demand without going through me. And as for the fine, consider it null and void. You can take me to court if you want, but trust me, you won't win. There was a long pause as the weight of Walter's words settled in. The residents who had been silent up until now began to look around at each other. Some of them were angry, others were ashamed. The veil had been lifted, and they finally understood the truth about Nancy and her HOA. Nancy, now visibly shaken, tried to regain her composure. You can't do this, she spat, her voice shaky. This is outrageous. I've worked hard to maintain the integrity of this neighborhood. Walter shook his head, his expression calm but resolute. No, Nancy, you've worked hard to control it, and that's where you went wrong. You thought you could push people around, threaten them into submission, but you've underestimated the people who live here. You've underestimated me. The room was still, the weight of Walter's words hanging in the air. Finally, one of the residents stood up, a woman Walter recognized from down the street. Her name was Mavis, and she had always been one of the quiet ones. She wasn't part of the HOA, but she had always been friendly with Walter. Mavis, Nancy said, her voice shaky. What are you doing? Mavis ignored her and turned to Walter, nodding. I've been living in this neighborhood for over 30 years, she said, her voice firm. I've seen what you've been doing, Nancy. It's time we all took a stand. I'm with you, Walter. And just like that, the floodgates opened. More and more residents stood up, one by one, showing their support for Walter. They had had enough of Nancy and her HOA's tyrannical rule. It was over. Nancy stood there stunned as the room erupted into applause. The power had shifted, and there was no going back. The HOA meeting ended in stunned silence, then a slow murmur, then outright commotion. Neighbors who had once nodded politely to Nancy now turned their backs. Some walked out shaking their heads. Others whispered in corners, recounting stories they'd long kept to themselves, about threats, fines, humiliations they'd endured under her rule. Walter didn't have to say another word. The documents had spoken for him. The look on Nancy Whitmore's face, one of pure disbelief and dread, was the sweetest vindication he'd ever felt. But Walter wasn't finished. The very next morning, while mist still clung to the pavement and dew sparkled on the grass, Walter got to work. He posted a large, hand-painted wooden sign at the entrance of the road. It read, Private property. Road use temporarily suspended due to liability risk. Access available by request through owner. Contact W. Grady. Within hours, cars began backing up at the main entrance to Woodland Pines. School buses stalled. Delivery vans idled. HOA board members were trapped in their driveways. The entire neighborhood had been built on the assumption of permanent, unquestioned access. But legally, they had none. Nancy called Walter that afternoon. Her voice was no longer cold and commanding. It was thin, desperate. Walter, she said, we need to talk. We should have done that months ago, he replied calmly. But now you'll have to speak through my lawyer. And she did. Through gritted teeth, through red-faced attorneys, through emergency mediation meetings at the county courthouse, Nancy and the remaining HOA board had to swallow the truth. Walter held all the cards now. His demands were firm, but fair. Immediate cancellation of the $50,000 fine. Full public apology from Nancy Whitmore to be delivered at the next community gathering. Her resignation, effective immediately. Dissolution of the current HOA board and creation of a new resident-led community council with limited powers. A symbolic $1 per year lease agreement for public road use, renewable at Walter's discretion. At first, they resisted. Nancy tried to fight the deal, insisting on renegotiation. But residents, now furious at the months of bullying and the chaos caused by the road closure, turned on her. She was forced to step down, her pride shattered. That next community meeting was packed to the walls, lawn chairs overflowed into the street, and when Nancy Whitmore stood in front of the crowd with a microphone in hand, the woman who once towered over others with her rules and threats barely managed to get her words out. I apologize to Mr. Grady and to the residents of Woodland Pines for the overreach and unnecessary distress caused under my leadership. Effective today, I resign from the HOA. There was no applause, just silence. Walter, seated quietly off to the side, gave a respectful nod and stood up to leave. The moment wasn't about gloating, it was about reclaiming peace. The weeks that followed were some of the most peaceful the neighborhood had experienced in years. The new resident council was formed. No titles, no rigid enforcement, just neighbors helping neighbors. The rules became suggestions. The ridiculous fines disappeared. People started planting flowers without asking for permission. Kids rode their bikes down the street freely. Dogs barked, birds sang, and nobody got a violation notice in the mail. Walter, for his part, kept his word. He reopened the road, charging the HOA $1 a year under a formal lease. He even had the lease framed and hung on his wall, right next to his father's old toolbox. It was a reminder, not of the fight, but of what happens when you stand your ground. He also rebuilt the fence, but not with modern plastic slats or HOA-approved white paint. No, he used reclaimed cedar wood, just like his father had. He carved a small inscription into one of the central posts. It simply read, "Built by my father, defended by his son." One afternoon, Mavis, the elderly neighbor who'd first stood up for Walter, came by with a basket of peach cobbler. She looked at the new fence, then at Walter sitting in his rocking chair. "You showed them," she said softly. Walter smiled, sipping his sweet tea. "I didn't have to shout, Mavis. Just had to show them what quiet people can do when they've had enough." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the cicadas sing and the breeze rustling through the trees. The road was quiet again, not because people were scared, but because peace had returned. Later that week, kids from the neighborhood came by and asked if Walter could teach them how to build a birdhouse like the ones on his porch. He chuckled and invited them to the backyard, pulling out tools from the same shed where he once prepared for battle. The fence, the road, the land, it all stood as a symbol now, not just of ownership, but of legacy and the strength of standing up when no one else will. Some folks think justice always comes from a courtroom, a badge, or a politician. But in towns like Woodland Pines and in neighborhoods across America, justice often begins with one quiet person saying, "Enough." Walter Grady didn't march, didn't yell, and he sure didn't go looking for trouble. He was just a man who believed in legacy, in honesty, and in land that meant something. But the moment the HOA crossed that line, trying to strip away his dignity and bulldoze his family's past, they awoke a lion in overalls. This story isn't just about one man and a road. It's about what happens when power becomes pride and rules become weapons. It's about a system that was supposed to serve the people, but ended up silencing them. Walter stood up not just for himself, but for every neighbor too afraid to speak, too exhausted to fight another fine, too broken to push back. And that's the lesson. Don't mistake silence for weakness. Don't confuse age with surrender. And never, ever assume you own what someone else built with their bare hands. The HOA in Woodland Pines forgot that. They forgot that behind every non-compliant fence or unauthorized garden gnome was a real person with stories, memories, and roots deeper than any policy. They thought they were running a neighborhood, but they were really running it into the ground. Walter didn't seek revenge, he sought balance. And in doing so, he reminded his neighbors, and maybe even all of us, that sometimes the strongest force in a community isn't who yells the loudest, it's who stands the longest. Now we want to hear from you. Have you or someone you know ever dealt with an overreaching HOA? Do you believe HOAs help or hurt communities in the long run? What would you have done if you were in Walter's shoes? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one, and your stories matter. Your voice just might help someone else find theirs. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you of home, family, or standing up for what's right, please tap that like button and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe for more real-life justice stories right here every week. Because sometimes the fence may be old, but the man behind it is stronger than ever.